As you've probably deduced by now, my name is Matt Simmons. I'm on Twitter at SandaloneSA. Feel free to talk about me all you want. My email address is there, and that's my blog, Standalone Sysadmin. All of the information that you're going to see, for the very most part, is on your USB key. I've included the slides, I've included some extra materials, and I also included, because you never know about conference Wi-Fi, I included the latest distributions of Nagios and Nagios plugins. So you'll be able to install it on your computer now if you want to play with it. Just a couple of confessions here. I'm not a Nagios expert. I'm not. I'm sitting in front of you because I've played with it and broken it and cried and sweated and bled. I still like it though. I mean, there's no reason for me to like it with the amount of pain that it's given me. It's probably Stockholm Syndrome or something, but I do like it. And that's a brief outline of what we're going to cover if we have time. Oh, hey, that's cheating. I have a brown coat trap in my Nagios, Sane. Everybody, how many people here have used or use Nagios? Cool, okay. So that means there are just a couple people here that don't have experience with it. This isn't an intro to Nagios. I would like to go over a lot of detail, but I don't think I'm going to have time. If you have a question, feel free to ask. I'm going to hang around after, too, because I'm sure we're going to run over just a little bit. I'm going to try to get you guys to lunch. So come ask me. But basically, the default configuration of Nagios is such that it's insane, and if you follow the examples as given, you will go insane, too. And, you know, the punchline is that you'll end up screaming, "Serenity now, Serenity now, Serenity now." Okay, so we're going to start off with some global advice. In other words, if you are a small site or a large site, this is stuff that's going to help you regardless. The way I kind of divide it in my mind, is there anybody here who has a site big enough that they don't actually generate their files by hand? You use a configuration manager? Okay. So you guys do use some... Yeah, man, and there are a whole bunch of really bad tools for them too. Okay, so I will go over that. So we'll go for universal PICC documentation, centralized authentication, which is very important to me, and plugin development. Okay, most important, read the documentation. You get this for every piece of software that you use. Everybody says RTFM, read the manual. It's really important because, especially if you have experience with Nagios 2 and you're now running Nagios 3 or you want to, your Nagios 2 config is going to work. I mean, there might be a couple small things, like, you know, a very small syntax error that you fix, and it's like, okay. But if you're still using Nagios 3 like you use Nagios 2, you're doing yourself a disservice. Because it has all of these new features, it has multiple inheritance, it has all these cool things that you're never going to know about if you don't read the documentation. And the URL that I have there, and you can click on it on your slideshow on your USB key, is the site that I find myself visiting more often than any other site on my computer, with the exception of maybe Reddit. And this is the object definition page. It tells you exactly what every single option for every single type of Nagios object is, and which ones are required, which ones are optional. Now, if you've used it for a while and you've played with it, you've learned that some of them are able to be bent and broken a little bit, but for the most part, that's it. If you're searching for more Nagios documentation, look for the 3_0 because that differentiates it from the 2_0. That's the 3 tree versus the 2 tree. You want the most modern documentation because it will reflect what you can do. There's a Nagios book, online, free, available, still covering 2. They're working on it. They're going to get it up to 3. So, I use centralized authentication because I hate nothing more than scripting password changes all over my network. I have my Apache set up, and I use a tool called Likewise Open. I actually built an Active Directory infrastructure to authenticate my Linux machines. Nobody looks very stunned. That's awesome. I have like 100 Linux machines, 2 Windows machines. They're virtual machines that run Active Directory. There are discussions about Active Directory on virtual, I know. But essentially, it allows me to create Nagios contacts out of my domain users. right? So I can automatically create people, on the domain have access using their own password to the CGI. I can dictate who is able to submit commands just like you could any other Nagios contact. I recommend using centralized authentication if it's at all feasible in your organization, because otherwise it's just one more thing to manage when it comes to dealing with your users, and it's one more thing to forget. Okay, global sanity, do not reinvent the wheel. There is a website, Nagios Exchange. It has nearly 2,000 listings, 1,600 of which are plugins, which are the actual programs that run checks in Nagios. 1,600. Someone has probably written what you're looking for. The problem is going to be that you don't know when they wrote it, or how good of a programmer they were when they wrote it. You have to test it and test it and test it, and you can't always guarantee that it's going to be the best piece of software, which is why you shouldn't reinvent the wheel unless you have to. So when you write your own Nagios plugins, again, read the documentation about plugin development on 3, because it has multiple line output. So you can do all kinds of trending and information based on the results of your plugins. You can do all sorts of things, and you can write it in any language you want. If you are sick enough to write in COBOL for your system scripts, feel free, because Nagios doesn't care. All it cares is what your return value is. All your monitoring scripts really care, or your graphing stuff cares about the output. It doesn't care anything at all about the language. The default plugins that are included on your key are in C. Lots of people write in Perl. I write in Perl or Shell or whatever. Whatever gets the job done is what it's about. Okay, so then there's configuration sanity. When you're working with the configs, it can get a little bit hairy. The guys who run large sites have web-based tools to deal with stuff like this, or at least would like web-based tools to deal with this, because if you've ever delved into a 800-line, Nagios host config file, you know what I'm talking about, and you probably hate it as much as I did. I spent my entire time in Nagios 2 dealing with 2 independent Nagios installations that were each, had 4 configuration files, 4 main configuration files, each of which had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of lines. I ended up writing horribly convoluted scripts to add, remove hosts. It was horrible. You don't have to do that. Watch. Okay, how many people here write programs? I'm not saying are programmers, I mean write programs, script, awesome. How many people here do that without syntax highlighting? Hardcore. You guys, all right.
Or stupid.
Well, I mean, you can turn on syntax highlighting almost accidentally now in every editor. So, okay, this is what it generally looks like when you're editing a Nagios config. There's no reason it has to look like that. It could look like that. Right. 1 or 2. 1 or 2, which is better. Right.
2.
What?
No, wait. 2.
2. Yeah.
Can you show it again? Can you show it again?
There's no reason not to. It will do nothing but help you. I've included the Vim and the Emacs highlighting configuration on your key. Check in the Nagios directory, it's all in there for you. Let me know if you have any problems with it. It installs just like any other .vim, syntax file. Okay, and configuration file hierarchy. This is one of my pet peeves, and actually the blog entry that I wrote that led to this was basically me bitching about the configuration file hierarchy, because it's horrible. By default, it's flat, it's not nested, it's 4 or 5 files, one of each is devoted to an object type. Why in the name of God would you do that to yourself? It's horrible. There is a directive that is commented out in the default configuration, and I do not know why. It is config_dir, okay? Normally it has config_file, and then it's the file name, and it has that about 6 times. One for every configuration file that you have. You could, theoretically, add 1 line every time you add a file. Or you could just put them in a directory and add it once. Why? I mean, that's not even, you don't have to think about that. Okay. What it also does, if you guys do have big sites, and you have a networking group, and you don't want to worry about your networking hosts, you want to worry about your hosts, the networking group can have write permission to the networking group. They can make their own files. No problem. As long as you have some kind of dedicated testing involved to make sure they don't break your glorious config, there's no issue. Okay? And the hierarchy that I'm going to suggest does not necessarily work for you. It works for me, because that's kind of the way my brain is aligned. Use what works for you, because I don't know what works for you, and these guys don't know what works for you, so you've got to figure it out yourself. You know? There's no reason that you can't play and work and find something that makes sense. Okay? This is tree minus D on my Nagios directory. Okay? Very, very simple. I have a root. I have commands, because this was a while back when I wasn't really dividing among commands. And generally speaking, my generic commands. Ping doesn't change a whole lot. We'll go in commands. I have computers. I have a generic computers.cfg. Okay, so you've got, actually in the root directory I should say, you do have I have a templates.cfg file where I have the most generic host, the most generic service, the most generic, you know, everything that basically says, here are all of the Sane defaults. And it's not going to be enough for a complete object because you have to specify, you know, an IP address and all the other stuff. But it is enough to say, I don't want a 15-line entry later because I don't care about. I'm always going to ask for 24/7 checking. I'm always going to ask for 24/7 alert. Why do I have to put that in every line? There's no reason. Put it in the root, in the generic, and then have your computers.cfg generic computer object use the generic, and then have your Linux inherit the computers, and then have your Windows inherit your computers. You know, don't reinvent the wheel 1,000 times. Save yourself the time and the effort of wondering what's in, you know, this and there, and keep it straight like that. Simplify. Okay, there are a couple regular expression-based configuration directives that you can enable so that when you do matching on service entries and stuff like that, you can group your computers like that. So if you've got 4 file servers, FS1, FS2, FS3, and FS4, you could list FS1, FS2, FS3, FS4, or you could, if you have this option enabled, FS question mark. It's like a regex. More like globbing, but you know, that's what it's for. There's also this, use true regex matching, which does not necessarily always work the way you want it to because it actually parses it. If you're on man regex, it will tell you, you know, how these regular expressions work. Lots of people are surprised. Periods are no longer a period, you know, necessarily. It can get hairy. Use it if you're comfortable with it, and test it. Test it. Okay.
Does it match to other known regular expression engines?
I honestly don't know. There's not a whole lot of documentation about it.
There you go.
Yeah. And from what I've heard, everybody has the same warning I have. Only use it if you test it and if you really know what it's going to do. I haven't opened up the source code and read the parser, so
Just curious.
yeah, I don't know. I'm sorry, but if you find out, email me because I'm curious.
What is the source base? What language?
C.
Okay.
Right now, the actual binaries are, well, binaries, the code's in C for the Nagios scheduler and for the CGIs. Soon they're switching the CGI, the web-based interface, into PHP. There are many, many arguments for and against that. I'm not going to dive into them right now. Okay, so you guys have notifications, right? Because you like to know when things go down. Okay. That is an atrocity. Would you like to add some information to that line? How about adding that how about adding in information to, 4 of those notifications? Because you always got notify host by email, notify host by SMS, notify service by email. That sucks. I don't want to edit that. My God. God forbid I should copy and paste it with VI and it, does word wrapping, breakage, and horrible, horrible things. Hey, look at that. As most of you guys probably know, on a Unix command line, if your line is terminated by a backslash, that doesn't mean the command's over. That means the command continues on the next line. As it turns out, you can do that with Nagios too. So if you've got multi-lines worth of stuff here and you want to make it readable, just throw a backslash. I apologize for the fuzzy font on here, but I had to blow it up to make it big enough because that's how small it is compared to the previous slide. It's that kind of statement, right? Why don't you write your stuff like that? Because it's better. I mean, nothing else to say. Okay. Revision control, version control. I'm a fan of it. I haven't implemented it yet. I'm guilty, I know, but I know I should. And I'm going to. It's in my plan. You should too, because if you have more than one person working on it, you really want to maintain who broke it. And if it's only you, you know who broke it, but you'd really like to fix it. So if you put it in Subversion or Git, if your flow works like that, you have basically a history of everything you've ever done with Nagios. You can go back and look. You can check out another revision. You can even use hooks so that it automatically updates on your Nagios server. It's cool. Why not? If you're doing it, now, and it's just plain files, you're not using the web interface, and and monitoring is really important to you, you should keep it in some kind of repository, and then of course back to repository.
RCS is simple, good for learning people as well.
So I use RCS.
Cool, awesome. Use Git? Cool.
Just moved from SVN.
Oh yeah, very cool. I've heard a lot of people doing that, making that move. So it's got to be, it's got to have something going for it. Okay, inheritance. Inheritance is really cool, and I have the abuse inheritance there. I'm really of mixed mind. There are some really powerful things you can do with inheritance in Nagios. There are some really bad corners you can work yourself into if you don't keep track of what's inheriting what. You can have, you can get into cyclical inheritance, and you can get into, I recommend using it because it does make it much easier to configure each individual node. But I don't recommend pushing it beyond what you're comfortable with. And that really should be your guide for all system administration activities. If it's production, then you know how it works. If you don't know how it works, then it's not production because you can't count on it. Test it, play with it in a sandbox, but use it if it's powerful for you. If it's too powerful, it's too unwieldy. If you can't hold that sword, don't play with it. Okay. Host groups. This slide was inspired by 2 interactions that I had. One was last week on a forum called the Sysadmin Network, which is sysadmin-network.com. And then I asked a couple guys some questions in the hallway here, and one of them used service groups, or host groups, one of them didn't. I thought, it's more anecdotal than evidence, but still, half of people don't use it apparently, so let's talk about it. Okay, this is the way that I originally created my Nagios configs, right? I would have a service, say SSH. I would run, the check command was check SSH. That's Sane, right? And then, okay, if you read the Nagios documents, it says host name is required. It's in red in the HTML and everything. So I thought, okay, I need it. And it said, oh, you can put multiple hosts separated by commas. I said, that's obviously the way it should work then. That's insane. Let me tell you, looking back, it's like, all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. This is how it should work. And I hope you guys can read this, because this is so much better. Okay, so you have a host group, right? Those are all Linux servers. So we're going to create a host group and just do anything, Linux servers. Then we're going to create a host. The host use generic host name, right? And you're going to have one of these for each of the hosts anyway, so you might as well define the host group that it belongs to. The real magic comes when you define the service. You don't use the host name, right? No host name. You use host group name Linux servers. As soon as you do this, all of your Linux hosts get SSH checks immediately. Okay? So this can be extrapolated. Let's see if I extrapolate. Do I? No. Okay. Well, I'll explain. This is one service, right? Previously we had 50, we had a host name and then 50 servers. Okay. It's not terrible. I mean, like, it's inconvenient, but it doesn't suck that bad. But that's just one check. Let's check SSH. Well, obviously you want to check to see if cron's running, and you want to check to make sure that, you know, there's enough free RAM. You want to check make sure your disks are okay. You want to check. That's a lot of typing, or a lot of scripting, and a lot of debugging your scripts, and it sucks. Whereas you could just define the host groups that it belongs to. So you have a DNS host group for all your DNS servers. The DNS host group is set up here. You put a comma and then DNS host or DNS servers, and then you define the server, the service, the DNS check service, and you assign it to host group name DNS servers. Voila! It's like magic. It's great. It saves so much time. I really thought it was magic the first time I did it. And I set it up, and I'm like, because you've got 50 things in pending when you look at the CGI, and you're like, I didn't do that, but you did. It's just, you did a shortcut. You used leverage. Okay. You guys are all probably good typists. You all have laptops. You all use computers all the time. That doesn't mean you don't typo, because I know I typo a lot. If you read Tom's book, one of the things he talks about is scripting, automation, do it automatically. Even if you get your host declarations down to 4 lines, that's still a lot of characters. Even if you're using syntax highlighting, you don't want to have to screw that up. So just make a script. It's easy. Better yet, modify the script that I've included on your USB key. It's sitting in like objects/computer/host/Linux or something like that. I don't know. But take a look, it's in there. It's very simplistic. You'll need to modify it for yours, but it works. You know? You can either make one for all the other kind of objects that you want to make, or you could write one superscript, debug it once, and you don't have to worry about messing up your config every time you add a new host. Okay. This is one that I'm actually kind of proud of, although I really earned it, because my users would hate it, because I'd have to send out an IM or an email. I'd say, hey, I'm going to test the Nagios server. So all you guys are going to get a flood of messages, don't worry about it. You know, it's all fine, and of course there's like one false negative in there, and you don't have any FTP for your customers or something like that. That's not good. Okay, have an alternate config file, right? So if you look, I have a config.mat only, and I have a config.everyone or something like that, and it's a symlink. I symlink to the everyone when I want everyone to get the messages. If I'm adding a host or testing and I want to make sure that I haven't screwed something up and there's a very low likelihood that there's an actual problem, I just change the symlink to the mat only, and I'm the only one who gets the email. I don't freak everyone else out. Saves on email wear and tear, and my users have much more faith in me. Yes?
When you do that, doesn't that stop the non-testing alerts from going to the rest of the group as well?
The non-testing alerts, what do you mean?
When you make that swap, you're now the only person getting alerts, even though there may be real ones, correct?
Typically speaking, you're going to find out in the first 30 seconds to 1 minute.
I just want to make sure I
yes.
understand.
There is a race condition where you could.
So then my question is, why not just spin up a second instance Nagios with the testing?
You could. You could. I mean, I just don't have spare servers running around and, you know, able to access production environments.
Okay.
I mean, you could do that. If you test a lot and you're, you know, heavy in a development cycle and you're going to be adding a ton of stuff, go for it.
So one of the ways you can sort of test stuff without the spare server, without a bunch of symlinks, is you can have like ancillary or test host groups defined that if it's a new host, FS5, that you want to test a new fool on, you just subscribe FS5 to your test host group, but don't define your contacts to have authorization for this test bucket.
Okay.
Which means that your coworker won't get annoyed if it's a production host. If it's FS4, but you want to like tweak a check without popping everything, you can move FS4 into your test host group, which means when you modify check A, B, and C, you'll get the spam. You're monitoring everything else except FS4.
That's a good idea.
That's a way to tune the signal to noise ratio without taking down more than you need.
That's a really good idea. What he's leveraging, if you guys, I mean, just to clarify, leveraging the inheritance model and the order that you put the objects in that you inherit does matter. So if you put it last, if you put the test group last, then it'll inherit that last. It'll overwrite the notification settings, is what you're saying, right? And the groups
Well,
that get notified.
Notifications are powered by the intersection of like service checks and host groups, right? I'm saying like you spin up a second, not ping your coworker's host group, right? That only pages Matt, right? And you either stand up FS5 in this.
You mean in that by itself?
Or if FS4 needs tweaking, you move FS4 out of the production host group that spams the client into the test host group that only spams Matt.
I don't have my, I guess I just don't have my, and it's probably an artifact of the way that my network is politically set up, that I don't specify the groups that are contacted based on host groups, but that's a really good idea. So yeah, if you use host groups for notification, that will absolutely work.
Couldn't you set up an alternate instance of your notify SMS, notify email, and then overload that on your testing?
You could. I mean, essentially, I don't know. In my brain, just the symlink is easier. And like there is a small race condition if something happens in that 30 seconds or a minute until it's verified that things are working right. It's a trade-off. There are tons of ways, and if you find one that works for you, that's great. And email me because I'm interested in hearing it, because I like learning about stuff like that. Okay, plug-in sanity. I am a huge fan of SNMP, just because there's so much stuff it reports on, and it's so easy to install, and it's nearly ubiquitous. I use it. I recommend everyone else uses it because it reports on disks and network conditions and I mean everything else. You can even customize SNMPD to run scripts based on OIDs that you specify. So you can run your own little checks for whatever you want to check using that one interface without installing NRPE or any of those, which I talk about here. There are some times where you want the extra power or the specific Nagios software. I don't use it, so I can't speak to it a whole lot, but I have found SNMP perfectly valid for everything I've tried to throw at it. With the possible exception of disks. There's a little extra configuration with SNMPD and disks because you have to specify the disks that you want to check, and that's against my religion. Instead, I think you should specify the partitions not to check, the ones that you're specifically not caring about, because as soon as you specify the partitions that you want to check, you'll add a partition that you care about and you'll forget to add it to Nagios. There's just no reason to put that on yourself. Oh, and I do mention the use a plugin if you need to use a plugin. Use one that provides stats so that you can graph it later using whatever tool you want to use to graph. Right, notifications suck. Nobody likes getting notifications, and if you're like me, you twitch when you get that text message, even if it's from your sister. It's like, okay, I don't want to get that. Hopefully here are some ways to make them not suck as much. Try to get an alternate communication method. All right, the situation is, I mean, you guys all know the situation. You've got one network connection, you've got one Nagios host, you've got a bunch of hosts, and your network connection goes down. You don't get woken up in the middle of the night. Granted, you sleep through the night. The downside is you're going to have a really bad morning. Try not to do that to yourself. They do make SMS modems, and it's not within everybody's grasp to buy one. I understand, because they're expensive, and at least I think they're expensive. Smoke signals, I mean, whatever you can do. If you can get a host outside of that network connection and have it monitor the network connection and the Nagios host, that's what I'd recommend. I've got two data sites. We've got our primary, which is close to New York. I've got our secondary, which is close to Philadelphia. They each, I don't have any kind of clustered Nagios or distributed. I have two independent Nagios installs. They each monitor only their local things plus all the network connections, plus the other Nagios host. So that way, I will at least get a warning if something is wrong, right? And if I'm lucky, I'll get it from 2 sides and I can triangulate where the problem is. Not everybody has 2 sites. Some people have a lot more sites. Some people have so many sites they can't manage independent Nagios installations. You're going to have to customize it for yourself, but at least don't know not to only have one Nagios install. Okay? Yes?
Somebody I know, as his backup, used a fax card, an idle fax, and caller ID. The deal being, if it ever came from that number, the world is dying. And so you didn't get any more notification than just the caller ID, and it always worked.
That's awesome. Yeah, if you've got an asterisk system that is VoIP on the inside and you've got some kind of box line or something, that would work too. That's a good solution. Okay, parents. And I really wish I would have included a network diagram on here. There's a network diagram of the little test Nagios install on your USB keys. But essentially, parents show the path. Am I allowed to write on this thing? Yes.
Sure.
Awesome. Cool.
It's a quarter sheet.
I'm sorry, was that a time thing?
Oh, it's a quarter sheet.
Oh, quarter sheet, yeah. All right, I'm good. Put it on my tab. All right. Router, switch. That's a firewall. Okay. Basically, if this is your Nagios host, and that's your firewall, and that's a switch, and that's a router, if the switch dies, if the firewall dies, you won't be able to check the switch because it's in the way. However, if you don't set up parents, you will get an alert for the firewall, which you should, and the switch, which is annoying, and the router, which is irritating, plus all the other hosts that are on this side of the firewall. However, if you set up a hierarchy using parents, you get an alert for the firewall. Nagios says, oh, this thing has children nodes. I will check them, but I'm not going to alert on them. As long as you don't have the U of notification flag set, because those aren't down. Anything above the firewall is not listed as down, because Nagios can't tell you that it's down, it doesn't know. It is, however, unreachable. And all your carefully laid plans will be for naught if you don't set, or if you set the U flag, because it's still going to want to tell you, hey, by the way, this is unreachable. Adam?
Is this different from service dependencies?
Yes.
Host dependencies? Okay.
Yes, it is. I'll talk about those in a second.
Hey, Matt,
Yeah.
how would you deal with a host that has multiple connections to it?
Okay.
With parents?
There is tons and tons and tons of discussion, and it depends on if you want a logical AND or a logical OR. You can set a host to have multiple parents, okay? And that will say, stuff behind this isn't going to get alerted if both parents are down. But if you if you need both of these to work, then that's not going to work. What you have to do in that case is set up a service dependency. You create a service group out of these two things, or groups of services, and then you can set multiple service group dependencies on the service groups themselves. Does that make sense? Basically, clutch them together, and you say, okay, these two depend on each other. If one of them dies, I should consider them both dead. I honestly don't know how the notifications will work above that. I don't know if they'll be unreachable. I suspect they will, but I can't verify that. You're nodding your head. You say, what's your name, sorry?
Yeah.
Nick. Okay, Nick says yes. You played with it? Okay, I haven't delved into that, but apparently yes. So they always try to do what they deem is the most intelligent response to whatever condition there is, but you have to tell it what the status of your network is. So it does take a little bit of planning. You have to sit down and think about it before you set up all this stuff. It's not just a knee-jerk reaction. Let's see. Okay, right. So dependencies. Available for both hosts and services. The disks didn't blow up, SNMP crashed. If you use SNMP to monitor your disk partitions, or cron daemon running, or whatever, and SNMP dies, it's going to report everything else is dead too. Use dependencies. Make all those services dependent on whatever, SNMP or whatever else you're using to verify that those services are running. And you should be able to use inheritance for that too. and I do put here, dependencies are not parents. Parents establish a line between the host and Nagios. Dependencies establish logical object relationships. Anybody have questions about that? I know it's murky waters. Okay, no questions. Cool.
It's 5 minutes before lunch, but I guess you can keep talking until lunch.
Thanks. I won't keep you guys. I promise. Like I said, I'll stick around to talk, but if I will excuse you. Okay, notifications are commands. They really are, right? So you set them up as command, like any other command, which means a program runs, which means you can do stuff. You can fire electrical relays. You can do flashing lights. Please don't release the halon from a Nagios alert. Please. Not good. Okay. Oh, and while I'm on this subject, I had this in a slide to look at because I thought it'd be too long, but I'm still going to talk about it. There are, the name eludes me. What are they called? When an object, when a service or a host is down and it's an event, and it fires off it triggers an event. Yeah.
Track.
Sorry?
No,
It's like a trap.
the word.
Yeah. Okay.
Right, event handler.
Event handler, yes. You can run programs based on the response of your plugins using that. Okay, passive checks. If you're doing distributed monitoring, use passive checks because that's how it works. Basically, you have the Nagios command file. You have programs running on other machines that check. They check in with whatever is running locally. That program running locally submits the check into the config. Macros are good. Read that. There are like 60 billion macros. You can set your own. You can use custom variables, and you can use them inside of your scripts. Okay, flap detection. A lot of people are really iffy about flap detection. I like myself in battery on. Basically, every time a service changes status, it issues a flap detection. The later checks are weighted heavier than the earlier checks. If it turns on, it doesn't mean things are good or bad. It means things are going on. You need to look into it. Right? So it may be up, it may be down. You don't know because it's not going to send you an alert every time. Okay, scaling Nagios. Large installation tweaks. Uses less memory. It forks less, and it doesn't do summary macros. If you've got a large shop and your Nagios is too big for one machine, it's taking up all the shop, try turning this on. Now your checks and your scripts that run that depend on the macros will have to be rewritten, but try it. Distributed monitoring, we talked about briefly. There are tuning docs designed to show people how to do that. Centralized management. Yes?
Within the last couple of years, 2 or 3 years ago, there was a paper or talk at least about scaling Nagios to huge levels.
Awesome.
And the notes all are on the Houston's Lisa website.
Oh, very cool. Yes, check those out then. I'll probably link to those on my blog too. Okay. If you're solo, Puppet, or Chef, or CF Engine, then go for it. If you're not, look into it because you owe it to yourself to not have to do everything everywhere. That's all I'm going to say. I don't know of a good web configuration tool for Nagios. I wish I did. If you guys know of one that you like, let me know. Tell us now, because I don't. Over-reliance on event handlers. Don't trust too much, okay? Trust after you test, but don't just write a script that reboots the machine because it says it's hung. Don't. We talked about inheritance and using too much of it, and overcomplication. Simple is better, nearly always. Did you have a question?
Oh, no, I was just scratching.
Okay, cool. All right, and there are 2 sites where you can learn more. The mailing list's very active, and there's a pretty active group on LinkedIn. There are a couple other groups that are pretty much dead on LinkedIn too, but I don't really see any traction. Okay, that's it. Any questions or anything like that?
For people that use NRP, you can certainly do the same thing that Matt did for configuring the master upstream in terms of include gear or include CFG gear. So we make heavy use of CF Engine for all our machines, but we essentially, so we have a series of sort of baseline checks that everyone inherits. We found that if you can have multiple include CFG gear configurations in your NRP config, and it's essentially last roll wins. So we sort of have like a gigantic bucket of every check everyone on the planet will ever need, and that gets dumped into local CFG all or something. And then you have a bunch of machines, like a bunch of mail relays that are different, and need overrides to those checks. I have certain thresholds I want to change. I want the arguments to be different. I push those checks into, local CFG host, class via CFN or something like that. And so those overrides work. And so it works really well. And nobody's really documented it on the web on how to have sane configuration of agents. So.
And if there's one thing I've seen in Nagios, it's that it's extensive. And you can customize it to your site without actually hacking on the code, because they built it to be flexible. That's what it's for. So go play with it, use it, and let me know if you have any questions about the files on your slides. I've got a README file in there with a manifest and stuff like that. So all right, have a good lunch, guys. Thanks.